Baseball is an international game. Professional leagues and players are concentrated in a handful of countries located in North America, the Caribbean, and East Asia, but the game is far more widespread than is often realized. Well, what factors spread baseball outside of the United States? And how is it different elsewhere, both as a fan experience and as one expression of national character? One thesis for this lecture is that Cuba and Japan, the two most developed countries in the Caribbean and East Asia, respectively, adopted baseball early and helped spread the game regionally. Imperialism is another historical force that spread the game. And then, of course, there's the fun of baseball. That's a factor too. This is John Bodden, Professor of History, and today I'm talking about baseball outside of the United States. In 1871, the Japanese imperial government hired Horace Wilson, pictured left, a Civil War veteran from Maine, to assist with the country's educational system. Now, this was during the Meiji Restoration, a period in Japanese history when the country's leaders wanted to rapidly modernize, industrialize, and catch up with powerful Western nations like England, Germany, and the United States. So they hired military advisors from abroad, engineers and educators, and Wilson was one of them. Around 1872, Wilson decided that university students in Tokyo University, needed more physical exercise. So he introduced baseball as a way to get outside, and he encouraged students to play it. Well, the game caught on. People in Japan liked it. Japan's industrialization and modernization program meant, among other things, that the country had more universities and public high schools than any other country in East Asia. There was more developed transportation infrastructure that facilitated play across the islands. And so Japan's high schools and universities developed a tradition of amateur competition. Beginning in 1915, Japan's high schools started playing each other in a great tournament. And today this tournament enjoys a broad fan base, much like college football does in the United States. The games are nationally televised, and all 47 of Japan's prefectures participate. So you can imagine the pride that Japanese people feel when their hometown baseball teams perform well in front of a national audience. There's a great deal of emotion involved. And many people who ignore professional baseball during the summer, well, they pay attention to the high school baseball championship. Japan's rapid population growth and growing national power had many different implications during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. First of all, there was large-scale immigration that occurred out of Japan. That's how fast the country was growing. And three countries in the Americas received Japanese immigrants. The United States, first and foremost, but also Peru and Brazil. And if you go to Lima, Peru, or Sao Paulo, Brazil, and you go to the Japanese neighborhoods, you'll see baseball parks. In fact, when I went to the Japanese section of Sao Paulo and got off the subway, the first thing I saw was a baseball park. Another thing that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the birth of the Japanese Empire. Japan defeated China in 1895 and acquired Taiwan as a colony. 10 years later, Japan defeated Russia in a stunning upset and occupied the Korean Peninsula. The dispute had to do with that territory. And then in 1931, Japan forcibly took over Manchuria, located in northern China. So without saying a whole lot about this process, you can imagine U.S. imperialism has created a lot of bitterness among many peoples in Latin America. And the Japanese occupation of conquered territories in Asia was not always appreciated, and has created these lasting resentments. But for our purposes, it's important to know that Japan's imperial authorities encouraged what they called field ball. Now, back on the home islands, professional baseball players from the United States began touring Japan in 1908, and tours of American professionals kept coming to the islands in the teens and 20s and 30s. And they would play amateur Japanese teams, college teams, high school teams. And the most famous professional of all to visit Japan was none other than Babe Ruth. I should add that Babe Ruth was fondly received. He swung hard. He thrilled local crowds, right? He seemed like a giant to the much more diminutive Japanese. Well, here you see Japanese Menko cards. They predate World War II, and the significance of the cards, one significance I reckon, is that they demonstrate a firmly rooted baseball culture prior to the late 1930s. After the truly terrible suffering and inhumanity of the Second World War, the Japanese people were defeated and occupied. They rebuilt cities, and not long after 1945 established Nippon professional baseball, the highest level of organized ball in Japan. It consists of two leagues, the Central and Pacific Leagues, each with 6 teams. And the differences between Japan's Major League and Major League Baseball are interesting. NPB stadiums have more foul territory, and the outfield fences are a bit closer to home plate. The ball itself is a bit smaller, but not by much. One very interesting difference is that tie games occur. The league permits extra innings, but only 3 during the regular season. So teams do not play more than 12 extra innings during the regular season. And isn't that sensible, I think? Other aspects of baseball in Japan reveal the nation's character. For example, players rarely change teams for more money. They tend to show loyalty to hometown fans. So there's less individualism than in the United States, we can see. Sadaharu Oh is a legendary player from Japan. He hit over 800 home runs during his long career, and one has to wonder how he would have fared in the major leagues alongside his contemporary Hank Aaron, and during the year of the pitcher, for instance. Well, you can find YouTube of O hitting homers, and his distinctive leg kick is really something to see. I mentioned Hideo Nomo in a previous lecture as someone who paved the way for East Asian players to enter Major League Baseball. And here I want to make a general comment about East Asian players. Very often they have distinctive batting stances and pitching windups like Nomo and O. In fact, it's something immediately apparent if you pay attention. The very same thing can be said watching Korean baseball. One gets the impression of a marked stylistic difference in how batters swing the bat, pitch, and throw. And of course that makes sense. Countries have different philosophical orientations and their own ideas about rhythm and balance. But first, a bit of background about Korea. American missionaries to the Korean peninsula introduced not just Christianity, but baseball. And baseball was further reinforced during the 40-year period of Japanese rule. Well, after World War II, communist China banished baseball from Manchuria, as did communist North Korea. They viewed it as a Western import and unwanted. Not so in South Korea. In 1950, after the Soviet Union had evacuated North Korea and the United States had evacuated South Korea according to treaty arrangements, North Korea invaded the South Korea. And very quickly, the country became a Cold War battlefield that involved China, the United States, many other countries. And after 3 years of devastation, the peninsula remained divided at the 38th parallel, and that division remains to this day. Well, one consequence of the Korean War is the fact that U.S. soldiers didn't leave. They have remained in the South on military bases, prepared for a possible conflict, and so there's been ongoing American influence in South Korea. And by the 1980s, South Korea had recovered from the war and emerged much stronger than its rival government in the North. And in 1982, South Koreans established a professional baseball league. So here you see a picture during the inaugural season of the American home run champ, Hank Aaron, who visited the country, and here he is seen offering advice to Korean hitters. The Korean baseball organization has 4 decades behind it. It plays a 133-game schedule and has consistently developed national talent. I should mention that 2 years after the KBO's establishment, South Korea won 2 Little League World Series titles in 1984 and 1985. So that success helped boost national interest in baseball, since Koreans love international victories, especially over the Japanese. And Korean players started signing Major League Baseball contracts in the mid 90s. And I should mention that the KBO and NPB, they signed players from the United States and Latin America. So let's pause for a moment on this topic. Leagues in Korea and Japan limit the number of foreign players on teams. So Asian scouts in the United States look for AAA players with some major league experience, usually men in their late 20s who are on the 40-man roster, and they offer them contracts. Well, what's the compensation like? Foreign players who sign contracts in Asia usually go from making about $20,000 a month in the United States to making $100,000 or $200,000 a month in Japan or Korea. So it's financially attractive. It's lucrative, and that's the larger point, that the market for baseball talent has never been more international, and it's becoming more international. Taiwan's relationship to baseball has many similarities to that of South Korea. Both were colonies of Japan for a time, which increased their contact and connection to Japan's sporting traditions. Both faced hardship in the aftermath of World War II, and both were aligned with the United States during the Cold War and received influence from the United States. Both countries industrialized rapidly in the 1970s. Well, the Little League World Series has an important story in Taiwan. Success in the Little League World Series increased the game's popularity in Japan, and a Chinese professional baseball league was established in 1989, and it continues to function, although its reputation has been damaged by gambling scandals. Does that sound familiar? But let's go back to the Little League World Series, which has been played continuously since 1947 in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. In 1969, a team from Taiwan won the youth tournament, and that team had a fantastic backstory that would have been turned into a Hollywood film if the events had happened in the United States. Well, in 1968, a youth baseball team from Taiwan called the Red Leaves beat an all-star youth team from Japan, and that thrilled the Taiwanese. That team, the Red Leaves, they hailed from a poor province. The players were of Aboriginal descent, meaning they faced discrimination for not being ethnically Chinese, the dominant culture. They were too poor to pay for travel to Taipei, Taiwan's capital at that time, but their community leaders somehow found the money and sent them to play against Japan's all-stars. Well, the next year, the same group of boys rebranded themselves the Gold Dragons and won the Little League World Series in Pennsylvania. And I love this underdog story. And not only that, in the years to come, Taiwanese teams would win the Little League Series 16 more times. How can you not be sentimental about baseball? Oh, one more thing. I'm the skinny guy on the left. This picture, taken in 2002, is from my visit to Taiwan to visit a friend, and we got to see the museum dedicated to the Red Leaves. The Lions of Havana, also known as El Habana, was a Cuban baseball team founded in 1868, just 3 years after the American Civil War. And El Habana participated in the first season of the Cuban Baseball League, founded in 1878. So baseball in Cuba is old. In fact, the first Cuban player to play on a U.S. team in its professional leagues was Esteban Bellan, and he played for the Troy Haymakers in 1872, just 1 year after the establishment of the National Association. Baseball has a long history in Cuba. Martin Diego, pictured center, was a black Cuban who played in the American Negro Leagues, but it was in Mexico where he acquired the nickname El Maestro, the master, where he posted truly superhuman numbers. In 1938, he won 18 games, lost twice, and posted a .9 ERA, while also winning the league's batting title. And G-Eagle played with American stars, Negro League stars, such as Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, and Satchel Paige. And he played in Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, none other than Fidel Castro appointed him Minister of Sport, and he held that position until his death. The poster on the right depicts a series of games between two of Havana's very best teams and the St. Louis Cardinals. And this occurred in 1936. The Cards won 2 of the games, and Havana's Leones won 1-2. So the best of Cuba could compete with a major league team from the United States. The more interesting question, I think, is why Cubans got into organized baseball so early compared to other countries in Latin America. What explains it? Well, for one, upper-class Cubans traveled north for education in the 19th century, and they encountered baseball at universities and in American cities. It became a widely played sport on the island during the second half of the 19th century. Another reason why baseball caught on so fast is that Cuba was a more developed country than Mexico, Venezuela, or the neighboring Dominican Republic. Cubans were more urban, more educated, more affluent. And crucially, rail lines connected Cuban cities. So that by the late 1880s, there was transportation infrastructure that helped to spread baseball and facilitate league play. Historian Luis Perez Jr. has written that baseball in 19th century Cuba was an expression of change and an agent of change. Despite its American origins, baseball developed a strong association with Cuban nationalism because Spain controlled the island for most of the 19th century. And as a separate Cuban identity grew stronger, baseball replaced colonial Spanish sports such as bullfighting. Cubans saw in baseball democratic virtues, subordinating oneself to the whole, waiting your turn to bat, cooperation. Without recapping the various patriotic insurrections against the Spanish Empire, I will say that Cuban patriots had been fighting the Spanish for decades before the United States intervened in 1898. And in the decades that followed, a neo-colonial relationship developed between Cuba and the United States. Guantanamo Naval Base is one vestige of this period. But baseball in Cuba, as I've said, is much older than Guantanamo. In the mid-20th century, Havana had a large stadium that American teams rented for their spring trainings, including the Brooklyn Dodgers and the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And I should add that the Dodgers preferred Havana in 1947 precisely because Florida, where they normally held spring training, was still racially segregated. And you might recall that Jackie Robinson was on the team at this point, and the Dodgers didn't want him to face ugly Jim Crow laws, so they went to Cuba. The image you see now is of Fidel Castro and one of his commanders, a man named Camilo Cienfuegos. Their jerseys read Barbudos, or Bearded Ones, and they were playing in an exhibition game on July 24th, 1959, the same year the Cuban Revolution triumphed. And in this exhibition game, Castro pitched 2 innings, and while he would tour the country, he was known to swing a bat with workers and talk with them about baseball games. Now, one thing to know about Fidel Castro is that he declared himself a Marxist-Leninist in 1961, not long after defeating a failed U.S. invasion of his country at the Bay of Pigs. After that event, he aligned with the Soviet Union to find a partner that could provide protection. And the two countries, the United States and Cuba, have not had normal diplomatic relations ever since this Cold War moment. Well, what about the implications of Cuba's Marxist government for baseball? Well, in 1961, Castro dissolved his country's professional league because good socialists shouldn't earn money from sport, or at least lots of money from sport. It's a recreation. It's a violation of socialist ideals. At least that was the idea 60 years ago. The league system in Cuba has been officially amateur ever since 1961. The best players do earn stipends for training and playing at the international level. But then after the Cold War ended in the early 90s, Cuba's economy went into a tailspin, and many of its best players developed second thoughts about socialism, we might say. But Cuban ball players couldn't just sign a contract to play in Japan or the United States because Cuba's government refuses to let its best players leave the island. And that takes me to my next point. Many Cuban ball players have defied their government and defected to surrounding countries, often at great personal risk. The desire of Cuban players to leave home and seek opportunities elsewhere has been a real source of embarrassment for the Cuban government, and it's a hardship for players who are not allowed to return home if they defect. And there's something about the situation that reminds me, in a general sense, of the Cold War relationship between the United States and Cuba. Cuba's government hasn't taken an especially flexible position on this issue. And then you have the U.S. trade embargo, which is still in force 6 decades after its inception. It's totally anachronistic at this point, as is Guantanamo Naval Base. The two countries cannot resolve their differences. Now, recently the Cuban government and Major League Baseball negotiated a framework that would create legal channels for Cuban players to go abroad and sign contracts, while the Cuban government, for its part, would receive compensation from Major League teams that hire Cubans. So kind of a win-win for socialism and capitalism. But the U.S.-Cuba situation is always in flux, and the new arrangement was scuttled after the election of Donald Trump. But now a quick comment about sport as an expression of national character. The man pictured in the middle, Yasiel Puig, is widely known. He's a controversial figure in baseball. He licks his bat. He talks to his bat. And he plays his playing style. He plays with wild abandon. And after being smuggled into Mexico by traffickers, he was signed to a huge contract. The Dodgers signed him, and he immediately made an impact on the team. Well, I mentioned he was controversial. Well, one thing about Puig is he never shied away from expressing his emotions. He flipped his bat, he smiled a lot, laughed a lot, and shouted. He always took big risks. And Puig's swagger reminds me of things I saw in Havana at baseball games when I was there. There's generally more swagger and fun, I think, to the Latin American game. Americans sometimes call it showboating. And I think, the Latin American answer to that might be, hey, this game is supposed to be fun, isn't it? The Dominican Republic was a much, much poorer island than Cuba in the 19th century. It had a less developed transportation network, far lower rates of literacy, and it would really be Cuban and Puerto Ricans that influenced the island's sporting traditions along with the United States. To give an example of that, Cuban patriots escaping Spanish persecution in the 1870s brought baseball to cities in the Dominican Republic, such as Santo Domingo. And then sugar plantations on the island established baseball leagues, much like the industrial leagues found in the United States at the start of the 20th century. And this was another path of diffusion for baseball. In the 1920s, the United States Marine Corps occupied the countries. They did that to stabilize the Dominican Republic, to instill democratic institutions. At least that was the rhetoric of the day. And American Marines played baseball during moments of rest. But the most important thing the Americans did was to train a man named Rafael Trujillo. And they empowered him. And once the Marines were gone, Trujillo got control of the country and its military. And he established a very lengthy dictatorship, and a brutal one. Well, one interesting thing about Trujillo is he wanted a top baseball league. He wanted a great team in the capital city. And so, looking to the north, one of the things he did is, hire the very best Negro League stars available at that time, including Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, and Cool Papa Bell. And Satchel Paige described this experience in his memoir, and he and other Americans discovered that playing for a dictator was not always fun, and that league folded after the 1937 season. But the point is that baseball comes to the Dominican Republic through regional influence, Cuban influence, American influence, and Dominicans they didn't have as much money as their wealthier neighbors, Puerto Rico and Cuba. Less money for baseball equipment. And something interesting happened in the 1970s, and that is the development of a game called Vitilla. It's a bat and ball game that uses broomsticks and plastic water bottle caps, or vitillas. And like cricket, there are no walks, and and there aren't any fielding gloves, so you don't need a leather glove. The pitcher actually aims to hit a standing target. It's not exactly a wicket. It's a little bit like a miniature stop sign. And so this game, it's highly adaptable to urban environments, as few as two people can play. And Bitia has been credited with developing Dominican hand-eye coordination. If you're curious what the game looks like, I encourage you to check it out on YouTube. It strikes me as a very fun game and an interesting offshoot of games like cricket and baseball. This graph illustrates the dominance of Dominican players in the major leagues. And Dominicans are by far the largest non-American group in the majors, and it's been that way for a quarter of a century. Future Hall of Fame players David Ortiz and Adrian Beltre hail from the island, and we've already talked about Pedro Martinez. Why is the Dominican Republic so dominant in the 21st century? Well, one reason is that several major league teams built baseball academies in the Dominican Republic during the 1980s. These academies identify and develop teenagers with promising skills, and the best ones receive contracts to play professionally in the United States, minor league contracts. And so this was a cheap way to find talent for major league franchises, and from one perspective, exploitative. Especially if the teenage boys receive zero education beyond how to play baseball. Now, for many Dominican teens, it's an attractive option going to an academy, even though most will never reach the major leagues. Those who do receive a contract, at the minimum, will travel to the United States, learn some English, acquire international experience, and these are things of value, to be sure. Well, I should also mention that the Dominican Republic is a much wealthier country today. Its economy has diversified, its transportation network is more developed, and according to the United Nations, the DR's human development is just below China's with respect to life expectancy at birth, access to healthcare, education, and per capita income. In short, it's not the same place it was 25 years ago. There has been very measurable progress, and I wanted to mention that. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, American forces occupied Puerto Rico, and the island, unlike Cuba, did not become a sovereign country. It has remained a U.S. territory ever since. And without delving into these complicated political issues, I want to say a few important things. Puerto Ricans have been U.S. citizens since 1917. They pay federal income tax and can move freely to the United States. And many Puerto Ricans have done just that, moving in large numbers to northeastern parts of the country in particular, especially New York City. And there, Puerto Ricans found a baseball-saturated culture. The poster you see advertises a game between two Puerto Rican teams in 1924 in New York City. Puerto Ricans played in the Negro Leagues, and Negro Leaguers played in Puerto Rico. Professional baseball was established on the island in the 1930s, and its winter league was a place where Americans, Negro Leaguers really, could go for additional income. And Hall of Fame Puerto Rican star Roberto Clemente remembered these Negro League stars and players coming to San Juan and he was exhilarated by them, fascinated by these Americans who came to the island. So a strong baseball culture developed in the early 20th century, and since then, over 200 Puerto Ricans have played in the major leagues, including four Hall of Fame players: Roberto Clemente, Orlando Cepeda, Roberto Alomar, and Ivan Rodriguez. Venezuela is a South American country not far from its baseball playing brethren to the north. Soccer is the favorite game in neighboring Colombia and Brazil. So why is Venezuela different? And like Cuba, Venezuelan university students traveled north to the United States and brought back bat and ball traditions to their country. But in the early 20th century, something very important happened, and that was the discovery of oil fields. Oil fields in the country, and U.S. companies. The U.S. companies that received contracts to develop the oil fields in Maracaibo employed large numbers of workers and encouraged them to play baseball as a recreational sport. And so by 1920, Maracaibo had 30 baseball clubs and 10 ballparks. And not long after, professional baseball was established. So there were a number of factors: interest in baseball, the presence of U.S. companies in Venezuela that encouraged the development of baseball, and then you have the population. Venezuela is a much larger country than Cuba, the Dominican Republic, or Puerto Rico. And so Venezuela is the second most important producer of major league talent after the Dominican Republic. And the first Venezuelan-born player to pitch in the major leagues was Alex Carrasquel, and many since have followed. One of the first things to know about baseball in Canada is that Canadians have been playing the game as long as Americans, or their variants. The country historically had very similar bat and ball traditions, and since the establishment of professional leagues in the United States in 1871, more than 250 Canadians have played in the major leagues. Hockey, as most people know, is the country's national pastime, its national sport, but baseball is just thoroughly North American, widely played and enjoyed in Canada as it has been in the United States. Mexico's favorite sports are by far soccer and boxing, but baseball has been played professionally in the country for approximately 100 years. And you will recall that the Mexican League attracted renowned players from Cuba, from the American Negro Leagues. Roy Campanella, Satchel Paige, Josh Gibson, and Cool Papa Bell, all Hall of Famers, played in Mexico. So Mexico, like other places, is one part of a larger story about the cross-pollination of Latin American leagues with American players, African American players, and it should be said that Latin America's leagues were international long before those of the United States. The first Mexican baseball star in the United States was a man by the name of Fernando Valenzuela, who played for the Los Angeles Dodgers in the 1980s and 1990s. And I want to remind you that Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, and other ethnic groups have felt more American knowing that one of their own was playing the national pastime, the American pastime, at an elite level. And Fernando was that for the Mexican American community in the 1980s. He was celebrated. He helped to integrate this new wave of immigrants from Mexico into the fabric of American life. This is again something Walt Whitman had said that baseball could do: integrate waves of newcomers into the American family. Panama is another baseball playing country. It had experience with the game before Theodore Roosevelt helped rebels in the territory break away from Colombia. It was what is today Panama was once a department in Colombia, and that was in 1903. Well, Panamanian rebels granted rights to the United States, an up-and-coming imperial power, for it to construct a canal that would connect the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. And it also conceded that this canal zone would be sovereign U.S. territory with U.S. troops and U.S. military bases. So, um, so Panama, from its inception, is a country that acquired a baseball tradition. It was reinforced by U.S. imperialism, the proximity of Americans and American soldiers to the Panamanian people, but it developed over time, and Panama has produced a number of very outstanding players. Rod Carew was the first Panamanian to enter the Hall of Fame, but more recently, the reliever Mariano Rivera, one of the best pitchers in Major League Baseball history. So Panama, a country with a relatively small population, but that has developed a strong baseball tradition. Now, every year, the six great baseball playing nations of the Greater Caribbean send their best teams, right, their club teams, to face off in a World Series that garners a great deal of attention. The Caribbean Series, or the Caribbean World Series, has occurred since 1949, and it's a fun, competitive tournament that involves the champions of the respective professional leagues in each participating country. And early on, Cuban and Puerto Rican teams dominated the contest, but since the 1970s, the winner has varied from year to year, making it a fun, exciting tournament. The Olympics had baseball from 1992 to 2008. And across those five Olympiads, Cuba won the gold medal or silver medal every year of competition. But you can see that Japan, South Korea, and the United States were perennial contenders. Now, a country like the Dominican Republic or Venezuela would surely field an outstanding Olympic team if either of those two countries decided to commit the resources to such an undertaking. And that's a part of any international competition. Does the participating athlete or national team have state support? The Cuban state supports its athletes. Now, if you're wondering about softball, it was an Olympic sport between 1996 and 2008. Apart from U.S. dominance of the Olympics, you'll note that Japan and Australia have been the other great contenders. Well, baseball and softball are slated for the Tokyo Games, and I wonder if any upstart nations will challenge the top dogs and perennial favorites of Olympiads past. One more thing, when the International Olympic Committee decided to cancel baseball for the 2012 Olympics, it was an impetus for baseball playing countries to organize a tournament modeled after the hugely popular FIFA World Cup. So in 2006, the first World Baseball Classic brought together 16 national teams for a tournament with its own very interesting rules. You can look into that. Japan defeated Cuba in the inaugural year. Japan won again in 2009, beating South Korea. And this tournament is held every 3 years. The tournament aims to expand the global interest in baseball and the number of teams participating. In 2021, has expanded from 16 to 20. There's a group stage, much like the World Cup. And in view of South Asia's cricket traditions, it would be quite a coup for baseball if the tournament could interest one day a country like India. The graphic you see now depicts the top 5 nationalities present on opening day Major League rosters in 2012. For the last quarter century, foreign nationalities consistently comprise between 20 and 30% of all Major League teams. And here are the number of non-American players on Major League teams during the 2019 season. 102 Dominicans were on the Major Leagues, 68 Venezuelans, 19 Cubans, 18 Puerto Ricans, 8 Mexicans, 6 Japanese, 6 Canadians, 5 citizens of Curacao, 5 South Koreans, 5 Colombians, 1 Aruban, 1 Australian, 1 Brazilian, 1 German, 1 Lithuanian, 1 citizen of the Netherlands, 1 Nicaraguan, 1 Panamanian, 1 Taiwanese, and 1 player from the U.S. Virgin Islands. I'm guessing you're surprised, perhaps, to hear that Lithuania is represented in Major League Baseball. Well, it is. And 34 Australians have played at least one game in the major leagues. And that takes me to my next slide. Relatively old professional baseball leagues exist in Europe. And the caliber of play isn't major league, but these leagues help explain why there are German and Dutch citizens who wind up playing on college teams in the United States, typically, and then sign pro contracts. What do Israel and the Philippines have in common? Well, you guessed it, a strong American influence, if not sufficient national interest to support a professional baseball league. Wrapping things up, I thought I'd mention how the fan experience varies from country to country. Booing players, for instance, is considered impolite in Japan. I'll also mention that in the Japanese grandstands, girls called Uriko move up and down, delivering beer to customers straight from kegs, beer kegs strapped to their backs. So every country has its own fan culture. In South Korea, there is constant singing. I can attest to this. I've attended a game in South Korea. Fans clap thundersticks together and generate massive noise during at-bats for individual players. Each team has a squad of cheerleaders who stand on top of the dugouts and lead the crowd in cheers and chants. Instead of peanuts and beer, you might sit down to try dried squid and soju, which is a rice liquor. A friend of mine told me how fun Mexican baseball games are. He mentioned the lively music, colorful mascots, and cheerleaders. And jumbotrons put fans on the screen and involve the crowd throughout the game. And you might sum up the fan experience philosophy south of the border a bit like this. Hey, baseball can be slow sometimes, it can be a bit long sometimes. Let's make that downtime more fun. Here are some of the materials I relied on for this lecture. As always, there are more questions than answers.